Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 169. Today we're talking about extending the DOM with web components. We are your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro, Leon Revel, Eric Eichenskin, Isaac Skin. See, this is what happens when I don't say the name for so long. And Danny Blue. Hi guys, how's it going?
Hey Justin, top form today, I see.
Oh yes, yes. Because my pronunciation is always spot on. So before we dive into extending the DOM and talking web components and things, we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, there's a new API, a new web API called the Off-Screen Canvas API, which basically provides a canvas which can be used in the web worker context, which sounds very exciting for sure. One of our listeners, Dennis Ryman, has created a nifty tool called UI Engine, which is a tool for developers and designers to build and document websites and apps. That sounds pretty good, so go and check that out. V8 6.9, it includes Liftoff, which is the new baseline compiler for WebAssembly, which will vastly reduce the startup time for WebAssembly applications. So it's really good to see more progress on the WebAssembly front. The AMP project has released an alpha version of their worker DOM library, which basically aims to provide a DOM API which is available within a web worker, which sounds insane and very, very cool. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that particular project. Tone.js is a super cool web audio framework for making interactive music in the browser. And there's loads of awesome examples and demos. So I really recommend you go and check that out and play around with some of those demos. They're really good fun. And kind of ending on like a positive note, there's now been more than 1 billion downloads for Node.js, which is a testament to the success of that project and the increasing reach of JavaScript itself. So kind of great to see those kind of things happening in the community. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Interesting things. I hadn't heard the statistic on the Node side. That's quite the achievement.
Yeah, totally.
And speaking of achievements, today we're talking about extending the DOM, doing web components things. We've talked about web components in various contexts, but actually we haven't really discussed in a while the notion of customized built-ins, which is pretty exciting. So let's just dive into it. Leon, you had written a post about this not too long ago. So for those who don't know what customized built-ins are or what we mean when we talk about extending the native DOM with a web component, what does that mean to your average developer person?
Yeah, so customized built-in elements are basically a part of the custom element specification. Custom element specification being one of the 4 specs that kind of make up the whole web component standard. And it's kind of a lesser known part of that particular specification because it wasn't initially supported by many browsers, not really kind of talked about very much. But the idea of a customized built-in element, basically, instead of defining your own HTML element like a fancy button and extending the HTML element interface, you can actually extend other interfaces such as the HTML anchor element or other kind of built-ins of the platform and kind of augment those interfaces with more functionality and make use of some of the built-in functionality of those interfaces already on the platform.
Why would you extend rather than just wrapping around like an anchor tag or an image tag? Like, what would be some of the reasons that you would want to extend the existing DOM elements? Like, you talked a little bit about some of it, but is it, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to say, just to clarify for maybe some people out there might not know what you mean by wrap. So you specifically mean you create like a basic standard custom element, which then in its template has one of these elements that you want to kind of utilize, for example, an anchor element. So if you think of a simple example where you basically want to detect when somebody clicks on a link and let's say redirect them somewhere else instead of redirecting somewhere to where that actually link is specifying. Obviously, that's a silly example, but it's kind of simple to understand. So what you could do is you could create a standard custom element which template has a normal anchor element within there. And then you could add an on-click listener to that anchor element or something along those lines, catch that event, do like a prevent default or whatever, and then, window.location href and send them off somewhere else. So that's certainly something that you could do just by wrapping a native element and not using customized built-ins at all. But there's some very compelling reasons as to why you would want to extend the elements using customized built-in element. And there's probably quite a few of those we can kind of go through. Depending on the actual implementation, there can be less code in doing it that way. There's also concepts to think about in terms of styling. So if you've got a website and let's say you want to make all of your anchor elements, your links red for whatever reason, then if your CSS code is specifically targeting anchor elements, then because of if you're utilizing the shadow DOM, then your anchor element within your shadow root isn't necessarily going to pick up that particular styling. So that means that because your DOM element isn't a native anchor element or isn't extending it, styling isn't going to get picked up. Those are the few things that might apply to that particular example. But there's loads more examples where there's some elements, such as the template element, which you just can't utilize some of the features that they have, some of the capabilities that they have via wrapping them. For example, the template element is a good one because the whole point of the template element is that it basically allows you to add inert HTML, which doesn't get rendered until the developer actually wants to render it. If you wrapped the HTML template element with a custom element, you wouldn't gain any of those features because the browser would just see your custom element and then the HTML content within it. And because it's not a template element, it would basically render it. So you wouldn't be able to utilize that unique feature of the template element unless you actually extended it using something like customized built-in elements.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's as far as like styling and stuff like that. Sorry, Danny.
No, you're fine.
Like with styling, there's a lot of problems. So like in general, and that would be one way to solve some of that. I know like projects like Elix, those guys over there, Rob Bear and I think it's Rob Bear, right? And Jan
Behrman, I think.
Okay, they wrote a recent few articles on styling where you could pass in custom elements into custom elements to actually style or subclass, which was really interesting because it sort of bypasses some of the shadow DOM issues. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
No, I've not actually seen that. I've heard about it, but I've not actually looked at the details.
I think the most compelling is that less code, but even more compelling than that is something like the template element wrapping. Like I thought that was very interesting because the whole point, like you said, of the template element is to control the timing of those elements inside of it. It's interesting.
So I had never even considered extending the template element until you said it just now. That's the first time I had ever thought about it, because I've personally been of the mind that you should just wrap it. Like that just seems like the easiest way to handle things. But when you actually bring up instances of something like the template element, where there are actually certain things that if you want to do them, you have to extend the native template element, which I actually think is very cool. Never thought of that.
Yeah. So if you needed to achieve the same functionality as the template element, that being able to put some HTML in there, not actually have it kind of interpreted by the browser until you decide you want to, you'd literally have to have the developer utilizing your component, specifying your custom element, let's say fancy template, and then also inside that specifying a normal template element to get the same functionality, because your normal custom element wouldn't be able to tell the browser not to render that content yet. So yeah, that's a perfect example. There's also loads of other examples as well where there's some elements that you wouldn't be able to wrap literally because of HTML like restrictions. So for example, a TR inside a table is a pretty good example as well, or something like that. Whereas for example, you couldn't put a custom element inside a T head and it be valid HTML. So again, the only way to actually add some custom functionality to a TR inside a table and still have it be valid HTML would be to extend a TR element. So there's another simple example which kind of makes a good case for customized built-in elements.
So I think this is also a good time to potentially bring up the syntax for this, because there are some perhaps not there's some perhaps not so pretty ways of saying, hey, I'm using my custom extended built-in element, but there are reasons for that I think actually tie. The reason that I bring it up is because of the custom TR and what is valid HTML. So can you kind of refresh? And I also haven't looked in a long time, so I'm assuming it's the same. Can you refresh our memories on what the syntax is, like how you actually use these things?
Yeah, so I'll try and describe it as best I can. Obviously, it's easier with slides or code or something. But if everybody is familiar with how you would define a standard custom element, so you would do class, assuming using AS6, of course, you'd use class and then the name of your custom element, extends HTML element, and then you would do custom elements.define, and then you would choose a tag name and then specify the class to be the prototype of your new custom element. But as we said, using customized built-in elements, you're able to actually extend something other than a HTML element, such as the HTML anchor element, etc. So you would do class, the name of your class, which is going to represent your custom element, extends HTML anchor element. Everything else is pretty much the same. But then when you define your custom element and basically tell the browser that this is a thing, you do custom elements.define, and then you specify your tag name. So again, let's say it's fancy-tr or something along those lines. And then you specify your new class, but then you also have to specify a third argument, which is some options, which is an object. And then you have to specify extends as a property in that object, and then also give it the tag name of that element that you're extending. So in this case, if I was extending HTML anchor element, I would have to specify A as the tag name to extend. And that kind of doesn't feel particularly intuitive, because you've already told it you're extending the HTML anchor element. So why on earth do you need to also tell it what kind of tag name that you're extending? And this kind of comes down to the fact that in the current DOM specification, it has multiple tagged or elements that extend the same interface. So for example, you've got the quote element and you've got the Q element, which basically extends the same HTML. I think it's the HTML quote element. I'm not sure which way around it is, but there's a few elements that actually extend the same interface. So therefore, just by specifying the interface that you're extending, that wouldn't be enough for the browser to understand, well, which actual element are you extending. So you've got to specify this twice, which is feels unintuitive. But once you kind of understand why it's doing that, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, although it's not perfect, obviously. And then just to finish off, how you then actually utilize that new customized built-in element in the DOM or in your HTML, you then declare an anchor element like you would a normal anchor element, and then you use this is attribute, and then you as the value of that attribute on that particular element, you then give it the name of your custom element. So instead of creating a new kind of HTML tag like you would do with standard custom elements, you would then use this is attribute and then specify your new customized built-in there.
Leon, I'm going to have to admit that sounds like a mess.
Yes, it doesn't sound the most wonderfully simple way of kind of getting around this. And I think this is why the whole spec's kind of been quite contentious in the sense that, it sounds confusing. It's not as intuitive as maybe the kind of standard way of doing things. I don't know. What about everybody else? Do you all feel that it's incredibly confusing, or there should be a better way of doing it?
I don't think it's confusing, but I've also read that portion of the spec. So I think one of the confusion lies in is that when we talk about customized built-in elements, we're talking about something that does not inherently work the same way as a custom element. They're actually two different things. So in the case of a customized built-in, you're using is syntax. against the thing that it's extended from, where I am an anchor or a button. So my anchor is whatever my class definition is or whatever I defined it to be.
Yeah.
And yet, if you call that same element that you define but extended from as a custom element, it actually doesn't hold. It actually does not contain. If you look at what it extends from, it'll actually just be HTML element. It'll actually will not hold the extend from you. It won't hold the thing you extended from. So if you're familiar with custom elements, you're like, oh, it is the same thing. It isn't real. It is, but it isn't. I think that's the confusing part, where because like the syntax is really not that bad when you look at it. Really, you're just saying, hey, I'm going to put an option, an extends option on my define statement. And then realistically, you get the semantics of whatever you're extending from, which is there's a lot of value in that, right? From a developer standpoint. So if I want to be a button or an anchor or whatever it may be, I don't have to re-implement the semantics of that element myself. I get all the goodness that the DOM gives me basically for free for that thing, which is really useful. From a syntax standpoint, I don't think the syntax is that bad. I agree that I think it's contentious because I know Apple still doesn't want to do this, which is unfortunate. But
Yeah,
I don't think
we
it's
should probably talk about that in a bit. I think Danny's got a question.
Yeah. So I'm actually curious, what would happen if you tried to create a normal custom element? So my element where you would normally just say extends HTML element. If you said extends HTML input element and then tried to define a custom element, what would the browser do with that? Because it doesn't have that extra bit of information that you need to provide it. So I'm just curious what would happen.
So you're basically saying you'd extend a native interface, but then not specify the third argument to the define method. I think it just throws an exception. I can't really remember. Justin, any ideas?
What it should do, I think, in the spec is it says that you basically don't get the special behavior. So if you extend from that thing and yet define it in the DOM as my element, it doesn't become that input in that case. It just becomes HTML element. I don't know that it'll throw an exception. I'm
going to find out.
That sounds like a good idea.
Do it right now.
Another really good use case or a good reason why you would use customized built-ins instead of wrapping, kind of important one that we missed out, is the progressive enhancement kind of story, in the sense that, so let's say I augmented an anchor element with some special functionality, for example, prompting the user to ask if they're sure that they want to navigate to this link. So if I was using a customized built-in element, and obviously by doing that, I would specify an anchor element in the HTML and say is, fancy anchor, whatever, with this additional functionality in. And if a particular browser didn't support web components or customized built-ins, etc., then what would happen is it would just fall back to a standard anchor element. So the user would still be able to navigate with those links and use the app or the website, but they wouldn't have the additional functionality, but it still perfectly function. Whereas if that element was a standard autonomous custom element, then basically they wouldn't be able to use it at all, because the browser wouldn't know how to render those web components, and the user wouldn't be able to click on anything. So that's another good reason to use customized built-in elements.
So I did just try this. If you do what I said before, and you just extend, I think I tried an input element or something like that, it doesn't throw an error when you are defining the element, but when you try to use it, it doesn't like it at all. It explicitly will not let you create. You get an illegal constructor exception, and it's saying that an autonomous custom element must extend HTML element.
Yep.
Sweet. Cool. That's good error. I dig that error.
Yep. And thanks for clarifying that, Danny. Very good.
Yep.
I think customized built-ins as a whole, because again, like there are customized built-in fills in the gap of other things too that sort of that autonomous custom element doesn't do very well, which I think we've all tried to plaster things on at one point or another, things like tab index or aria rather, where you have to do a lot of boilerplate to get even close, and even then it's not the cleanest experience of the entire world. Customized built-ins kind of help resolve that problem, though I will say you can't I think it's if I remember correctly, you cannot extend blink. Sorry, you just no blink. It's not a thing.
No marquee. I need my own custom marquee.
Oh, marquee.
I remember that was some of the first animations that were ever in a website that I did in college. It was the marquee element. It looked like a film strip as it went past. It was great.
You can't beat some of those first elements. I mean, BG sound. You want to remember background sound? Like, that was a thing. Like, I have some nostalgia for some of those things, and then I remember how people abuse them, and I'm like, maybe not that nostalgic.
They've got to keep them around just because, just for the nostalgia. They really have. like, I will stop using the internet if Blink stops becoming a thing.
Well, true. Well, so even I think those don't even. I think those come back as HTML unknown element now. Most of them.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
oh no,
I don't.
That's it.
Yeah,
I'm logging off.
I mean, they'll work, but they don't. They don't extend from HTML element. I'm pretty sure. I think that was a thing at some point. I feel like I'm gonna have to dig up a piece of documentation for that, but that's okay. I'll find it. Sorry, we've gone far afield. Somehow we got to marquee. So we kind of rounded out the question of, hey, customized built-ins, pretty cool. You get some nice features with it. But not everyone is currently super on board with this yet. Apple has said that that they don't really want to do customized built-ins, which is a shame because it appears that Microsoft and Mozilla are pretty much on board for customized, and that the last contentious bits for them had sort of been sorted out, at least to the last meeting minutes I'd seen. Is that problematic? Can we fall back in a world where does not exist within Safari?
I don't know. It seems like a terrible shame to me. I think. Do you have any opinions on this, Eric? I know we've chatted about it in the past.
Eric may not. There's no. I can't make a mark. Eric, I think walked away from his desk for a minute. He just said something in chat a little bit ago.
Oh, okay. Okay, my bad. Okay.
Do we just want to leave that? We'll just cut this piece out, and then we'll just leave a gap there for Eric to answer.
It's probably best.
And Danny just spilled coffee all over himself. Apparently,
I'm back. I solved that problem.
Okay, we'll cut this bit.
I tried cleaning it up with an eraser, and it didn't work.
Oh shit!
I don't know whether Justin, you just want to ask the question again about browsers not fully supporting this or whatever, and we'll start again.
Okay. So we've talked about some of the benefits that customized built-in elements will sort of give developers as a whole, and Mozilla and Microsoft have stated sort of in the past that they're currently okay with what the is proposal looks like in terms of implementation, but Apple has said that they don't really want to implement this, that they won't do it. Is this a problematic? Like, can we live in a world where Safari doesn't have is to extend and use built-ins?
I think it's a terrible shame, really. I mean, of course, you've got polyfills, which would allow us to, have this functionality across all of the platforms, including Safari. At least it'll work. But of course, it'd be better if we didn't have to rely on those polyfills and it just work across the board. I'm hoping that if this just proved to be a very popular feature with developers and some really good things come out of it, that Apple will be persuaded to actually implement the feature. So I suppose we'll see what happens.
I mean, I don't really know. I think it is really hard that is not implemented by all browsers, which is or with not even like the intent to implement, which is kind of the point of having these specs. So if you at some point, if any browser, like Chrome is at the moment seems very, like we want to do all the things, we want to drive the platform forward as much as possible. But it's, people are people and people have disagreements. And so if the folks that are working on Safari fundamentally disagree with the proposal, they are still one of the major browsers. So it's really hard for me to see this going anywhere without at least an intent, because it was like with service workers, right? So service workers are only now in most places, but there was, for a long time, there was, okay, yes, we will do it. We just don't know when it's going to be done yet. That I feel is a little bit different to this, where it's entirely possible they'll never implement it.
Well, even with the service worker thing, though, they were very quiet about service worker. Like there was never really like we'll get to it eventually, because for a while it looked like it may not get it for quite some time. The fact that we have service worker now and that they implemented it so quickly, like to some extent, I wonder if that is the sort of force of developers saying, hey, we want this thing. Because it became pretty clear right out of the gate that when Firefox and Chrome, when Chrome and implemented it initially, web developer perspective was pretty positive about it. Firefox and Edge, were working on their implementations, which were not an easy thing. I mean, service worker was, quite the thing. But I'm curious if we're in the same boat here with, Chrome having built-ins. We have a solid polyfill. Edge and Firefox looks like it's going to get it. It's in Firefox now, actually, behind a flag, isn't it? I think it's a nightly. So I'm wondering if positive sort of uptick of usage will do a similar sort of thing that Service Worker did, and maybe Apple or Safari will say, "Hey, maybe we want to do this." I'm hopeful.
You just say that Edge is getting customized built-in elements?
The last I had seen in terms of the intent to implement that was on the Chromium list was that the Edge folks were publicly supporting it, that they were generally okay with the proposal. So
Edge
I don't know.
Edge doesn't have custom elements yet, right?
They're working on that now. So
okay, all right.
Yeah. So I suppose that's its own other question, which has come up from time to time, I think, particularly with custom elements and Shadow coming into Firefox here shortly. When will Edge ship custom elements and Shadow itself? So they have been working on it. It's just a matter of, I don't know that there's a public timeline for when that'll get launched. But if they have public support for I'm going to take that as a positive straight away. And hopefully eventually as features roll out, we get these nice things. And then in the meantime, like Leon said, I mean, the polyfill does exist. So, I mean, how performant that polyfill is, I mean, we're not talking V0 Shadow DOM here. So anything is probably more performant than that was. Though, again, a feat of engineering magic, I will always maintain, because I still am amazed they did that.
Yeah, totally.
So, I mean, so we want it. We're a bit skeptical, but we think
I want it. I'm going to use it. Like, I think there's a lot of, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of value in that. I mean, we had it in V0, right? With
that's true.
Slightly different syntax. And it was one of those things that it admittedly wasn't, let's say it was just not spot on. Obviously, V0 was contentious. It was a contentious time. But at least we got to vet, hey, some of these things work really nice. I, too, would like to do these things. And then V1 came about. So I am hopeful. I'm hoping my hope is not misplaced, but you got to have hope, because otherwise and you have to be vocal, use these things, test them, tell people on the various trackers and mailing lists or Twitter or wherever your outlet is that, hey, I use this and it doesn't do XYZ, or I wonder why it does. I think the conversation is important. Otherwise, we don't get nice things in the platform.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down for me is how useful this thing actually ends up being for developers and the things they can create from it. If it turns out that it's incredibly useful, solves a lot of problems and makes developers' lives generally easier, then I think, browser vendors that don't support this particular part of the specification will be under a lot more pressure to maybe reconsider. If it turns out that barely anybody uses it, then maybe it's best to shop it from the spec, and at least then the spec's consistent throughout all the different browser vendors. Perhaps, I don't know. We'll see. But I am, well, let's say, the same as Justin, hopeful that we will get this thing and we can use it, because I think it's got lots of really good use cases for sure. One of the interesting things to talk about might be some of the things that you can't do with customized built-in elements, if you see what I mean. So the first thing that I thought about when I kind of discovered customized built-in elements, I was like, finally, I can finally build a switch which is just an input of type checkbox. So this was before there was an actual native implementation in any browsers when I was playing around with this. So I thought, oh, brilliant. So what I'll do is I'll take define a new custom element which extends the checkbox element. I'll then, in the constructor, I'll attach a shadow root to that element and then shove a load of new stuff in the template and kind of use some CSS that's defined in that component to hide the actual native checkbox UI. And then an input element of type checkbox is just going to appear just like a switch. It's going to look brilliant. And with the polyfills, that was totally possible and it looked really good. But because when the native implementation came out, and I tried it with the native implementation in Chrome, I believe it was, of course, you get errors because you're not allowed to add shadow roots to, I don't know whether it's certain elements or just any built-in elements. So, of course, that isn't a possibility. And I think that's a real shame. And I'm sure there's loads of good reasons as to why you wouldn't want to do that. But I was kind of disappointed that I couldn't finally create a switch from a checkbox.
So you're telling me we're going to have to keep using labels and before and after for custom checkboxes for the foreseeable future?
Of course, you could use the wrapping approach, that we talked about. But I just thought it would have been really cool to be able to do import type checkbox is switch, for example. I mean, that kind of reads nicely. It seems intuitive, and I thought this is going to be brilliant, but of course not possible with the current capabilities. I don't know whether anybody here knows is why you can't just randomly attach shadow roots to native elements. I'm sure there's very good reasons, but unfortunately I've not found anywhere that kind of discusses that.
Does it full on also not work even if you just not within a custom element? You know what I mean? Like if you just create a shadow root and attach to anything else, or is it something specific to the custom element?
I think so, yes. Now, bearing in mind this was a very early implementation, I mean, I don't think this specific problem that is specific to customized built-ins at all. So I don't know whether things have changed, or really I could do with digging out the spec and kind of getting some more information on exactly this. But I think, yeah, if you just create like a standard input element and try and attach a shadow root to it, I think it basically throws an exception. I can't even remember what the result is of that.
Yeah, so that's because for certain things they already have attached shadow roots.
Yes,
internal to the browser. So a good example of this is input. Input has its own shadow root. Similarly speaking, you can't attach shadow roots to things that don't inherently make sense to attach them to. So an example of this might be image, I think, if I remember correctly. Sounds right in my head. And that's in the spec too. That's in the shadow DOM side of the spec, where certain methods are not basically assignable to certain pieces of content or things that are inherent within that actual the DOM itself. So if you look through the spec, you'll actually see a list of, oh, hey, these are things you can't basically attach this to. Like, it's just not going to work. So that's why. Now, the why is probably a lot deeper in terms of functionality wise, why that you can't necessarily do that. And this it's an unfortunate thing. But this also, I will point out, this is also a good reason why we should keep adding things to HTML, which is because we cannot necessarily do these things, we should evaluate, hey, maybe there needs to be a new element called switch or something that fills those gaps where otherwise we, is a sort of developer problem where, oh man, it takes me a lot of boilerplate to do this. And I have to use labels and I got to do this workaround and I've attached a shadow to this thing and I'm hiding over top of something. These are good examples of why we keep, or why the platform should continue to evolve things. They're not just necessarily in purely the APIs, but also just in actual HTML itself.
So do you think that with this, the knowledge now and the ability to create, these custom built-in elements, do you think that will change how when browsers do inevitably decide to implement new elements kind of into the core platform that do X, Y, or Z? Do you think that things like customized built-in elements will be taken into account, or is it going to be something else that, like, oh, does the web component, does the custom element spec or the custom built-in element spec need to be updated with new elements that are coming in that you're not allowed to do stuff with? Or will they say, okay, we are going to keep these things in mind so that the way that people are used to working with these things will just work?
I think it's a question of what we voice from a developer / spec side standpoint. So if we're saying, hey, we would let's take the hypothetical of I want to add a switch and I want to be able to extend that switch and add custom styling to it, right? That's really the question of the day. Like, that's a use case that should be addressed either in the spec as to why it can happen or why it can't happen. Because that's the thing with most things that sort of move through the pipeline, having read many specs, is that there has to be a sort of that use case for a thing. Otherwise, why fundamentally would we necessarily want it on the platform? This is no different than the conversation around virtual DOM too. Like, why doesn't the platform provide virtual DOM? Should it? I don't know. Like, what's the use case for providing that? Is it going to be faster than something else that it previously exists? And again, like that conversation, those conversations happen all the time, right? We see them on GitHub, we see them, wherever. And if we want those sorts of things, then I think we still have to continue to speak up and say, hey, I have a use case for XYZ. This is the use case is probably valid, but maybe there's a different approach that, simultaneously can be taken both from the developer side of life. Here's existing APIs, and maybe this needs to be another spec, and maybe other people find that. Here's my draft on the spec side that says, hey, this is a thing that maybe we need. And then ideally, those things conglomerate into a nice ball of actual action that eventually moves forward. So yeah, I think you don't necessarily want to pigeonhole, right? Because other than we'll get, otherwise we end up with what's a good example? The black box that was app cache.
App cache.
Same thing,
talking
right?
to somebody about that today.
Right? Spect had a thing. There was a case for it, but none of those things combined to really do something that was feasible for most actual human beings. And if you knew those things, then you're Jake Archibald, and you. Because I legit, there were very few people who knew like the innards of it, and that was through trial and error and terribleness in most cases. So I don't think anybody wants to end up there again.
It'd be really good to maybe outline some good use cases and practical examples where customized built-in elements might actually have a practical use case. And obviously, I've given some silly examples in the discussions we've had, but I don't know, Justin, whether you've got any kind of solid examples which would, make people see why they could be quite useful to have as a tool for developers.
Buttons straight away. And the reason I say buttons, and people are like, it's a button. Why would I care that button is equals my magical element make any particular difference? It's because buttons on the web particularly are frustrating, not just from a not just from the developer standpoint of I need to implement this button with some mystical look, but the fact that most people do things that inherently don't follow sort of the accessibility side of life spec. That frustrates me greatly. Every time I see a div that's pretending to be a button, that I question the case for that. Like, why did you think that needed to be a thing? Because you're sort of throwing away the goodness that the platform gives you to make your life easier and make your users' life easier as they're trying to tab and do actual work. I think the button case for extending a button and making life really simple and nice and stylable and sort of scoped and compact, I think that case is quite lovely. Like, that's, replace terrible div buttons with the wrong ARIA attributes and everything else that are mystically hidden from tabbing because that's a terrible nightmare. Hey, button is, and then add the things that you need the button to do. That to me is like probably the simplest use case that I can think of that has significant impact on somebody's actual, usability life.
Could you imagine if you could actually customize the UI of drop downs? Yeah, like I can't think of one thing that
I would
I've
be out of a job,
implemented.
Danny. Like I don't.
Like I can't think of like one thing that I've implemented more times than drop downs. And those are actually can also be accessibility nightmares because you have to do your own tabbing, you have to do your own X, Y, or Z, or whatever library you're using to do it for you has to make sure that it's handled correctly. And yeah, versus just let the platform do it, which it technically already does. You just can't make it look very nice.
That's why there's whole libraries just for select inputs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is a very interesting one. I'm with you on that, Danny. Like every time you start a project, you're like, oh, here we go, drop downs, more drop downs. let's do that for the 600th time. Oh dear.
No.
I've got a simple. Go ahead, Justin. Sorry.
No, I agree with you all. I think again, cases where there are fundamental just problems, right? Where, man, I would very much to like to the platform to do more, but I needed to do a little more things than I like. I don't necessarily want to write my full-on custom element that's going to resolve all of my particular problems, right? Because I don't want to have to manage that thing, right? I have to define an API. I have to do all those things. Customized built-ins realistically solve that problem where you need a little bit more, but you don't want to necessarily have to reinvent the entire platform time and again, particularly for things that are just ongoing problematic. Is it going to solve all of our problems? Particularly not. No. I mean, that's just the nature of things. But if we can continue moving that sort of bar forward, I think we're way better off, both from again, users more happy, and as developers, ideally our implementations become more clean over time.
Yeah. With the drop downs and the styling thing, there is, I suppose, customized built-in elements aren't necessarily going to solve that problem, are they? Just because of what I described. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, but because of what I described with the switch situation, obviously
Correct.
You're not necessarily going to be able to overwrite the UI of the native drop-down element. You would have to do something more major, like wrap a drop down or basically rebuild it entirely. So customized built-in elements aren't necessarily going to solve that particular problem. But I think, as you were saying, Justin, if you just want to augment some additional functionality that isn't UI related on top of a drop down, customized built-ins are the way to go. And it's worth plugging the Elix project here. It was mentioned earlier on. Jan and Rob have done some incredible work with a set of mix-ins and a set of really kind of low-level vanilla JavaScript drop-down components which deal with all of the accessibility issues, the keyboard shortcuts and all those kind of things that you can just kind of plug and play and put together. And then because they're vanilla custom elements, you can then easily change the styling with those. So if you are looking for a solution to the styling drop-downs problem, and you still want all of the accessibility features and all of those kind of things without having to rebuild them yourself, go and check out the Elix project and look at some of the work they've done. It's pretty fascinating.
No, it's really nice. It's some really nice things there. I use them.
Yeah, on the project I'm on right now, I'm using one of their components. Very cool.
Yeah, it is amazing, and the amount of effort that's got into them for sure. I've got a practical example for customized built-ins. So a while ago now, I built a web component fondly named Image2. It's like Marmite. Some people hate it, some people love it. But the idea is it's just basically a wrapper around an image element, but it does some of the stuff which you kind of have to add in, such as pre-rendering and lazy loading the images. So at the moment, it's a standard autonomous custom element, where you specify image-2 as like the tag. But one way to kind of make that nicer would be to implement it as a customized built-in element. So then all you would have to do is go through your markup and basically tag any current image elements that you wanted to have the pre-rendering, the lazy loading, and the other functionality I've added. You just do is image2, and then you don't even need to change anything. And I think that's a good example of a use case for customized built-ins.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, again, like we're going to see, we're going to get that a bit as we tack these things on, right? It's not necessarily, there's no magic sort of bullets when it comes to this. I think that's the one problem that I see people bring up a lot. Like, I can't do XYZ thing. And the thing that a lot of folks want to do is realistically very complicated or complex in sort of the nature of its implementation. And, this is why I use framework XYZ, blah, blah, blah. And I get that. Like, at some point, you may need to actually write code that does something to meet some feature requirement or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, like if we get these nice little things that allow us to do what were seemingly very complex things in a much cleaner and sort of efficient manner, the platform as a whole is better off, because we just don't have to ship as much down the wire to end user browsers. And at the end of the day, if I can run less script, I'm feeling pretty good about life at that point in time, and even with like Chrome and things like built-in image lazy loading, right? Like that's going to be a thing, which will be quite convenient for all intents and purposes, but can still use things like Image2, where you're like, okay, great, I needed to do more than just the base little functionality. I can extend. Like, that to me is exciting, because at the end of the day, you still have the power as a developer on the platform to do what you need to do. Platform is not preventing you from doing those things. It's just trying to give you little bits more of API surface that you can use to do, at the end of the day, whatever you need to ship.
Well said.
It was said. I don't know if it was well, but
I heard you loud and clear.
Well, we're running up against time for this week. Is there anything we haven't particularly covered when we've talked about customized built-ins? I mean, there's a lot of surface to cover within the spec. Obviously, it's not necessarily there everywhere yet, but eventually, ideally, hopefully, maybe we get that. And there is a polyfill available, which we'll make sure to put into the notes. But do we miss anything else?
I'd just like to invite somebody from Apple to come and talk to us about this particular part of the spec to kind of really, solidify the reasons as to why they object. And if you look at some of the comments they've made, they're all very good reasons, and it'd be great to have a conversation from somebody who actually knows, all the details. It'd be really good to get, the perspective from both sides. Obviously, we're pretty much for this particular spec, so it'd be really good to have a discussion from the negative sides of it. So it'd be great if anybody from Apple wants to come on and talk to us about it. That would be absolutely more than welcome to have you on. So I'd just like to put that out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're even allowed to come out on a podcast, but hopefully. I think one of the big things, I don't know if we talked about it because I missed some of the episode, but I think the big things that they were talking about was it's in some of it, like HTML input element and image element, are in violation of Liskov's substitution principle. So that's the fundamental problem, is the subclassing. So like HTML input element, for instance, limits the usefulness for subclassing. So you could have, like he goes on to say, let me take a look here. We don't have any hooks for processing models, internal states, and built-in elements, such as the dirtiness of HTML image elements value, and when and how HTML input element picks the appropriate image. So there's some things on there, on those comments. I mean, and there are a lot of comments.
Yeah, and one of the points that was made is that because obviously these are native built-in interfaces, they're likely to get extended in the future. So if you, for example, extend the image element or another native element, and add to its functionality, and then in the future that gets that gets added to, then natively, then you'll be obviously you'll need to support that new behavior as well, and that's kind of where the problems kind of come in. Does that sound about right, Eric?
Yeah, I think so. And then we get into the whole MooTools issue, right? The flatten in JavaScript,
Yeah,
or Smoosh, or whatever you want to call it, Smushgate.
All right. Well, this has been episode number 169 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've discussed customized built-in elements, extending the DOM with your web components, as well as just what it looks like at the world of specs out there and all the wonderful things you can do with them, and ideally that you can contribute to. Tune in next week when we talk more things web platform, more things web. Have a great rest of your week.